Okay. My name is Francis Resta, R-E-S-T-A. I have 3 children and 9 grandchildren and 5 greats. So my oldest great-grandson is 15, so I feel like I'm in one of his classes.
What's up, Ms. Gist?
I live here in Davis. I'm an industrial engineer. I'm retired, of course. I'm 92, so I've been around a while. I was in the 102nd Infantry Division. I was a mortar gunner in a rifle company across Germany in World War II. I was one of the younger guys, so I got in late in the war, just the last year. There were guys like in the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, who were in the war for 4 years. I got wounded and sent back. Unless you lost a part and couldn't function, you were sent back to combat after getting wounded. Didn't have the experience or the privilege of getting out of it like we do in the modern wars. World War II was, of course, a world war, but also it was a whole U.S. People's war. Everybody in the United States was doing something for the war effort. 15 million were troops, were in the military. When you stop to think about the war being over, how do you get 13 million overseas? How do you get them back home? The Air Force, of course, had their own way. And the Navy had a little longer, but they could go home. But the Army, Marines didn't have that privilege. They made my division and many other of the newer divisions occupation divisions, Japan and Germany and other countries that we had been fighting. There are cemeteries all over the world where the American military were killed, that were buried, that were killed. My division is at Margraten in Holland. I'm hoping in May to take a trip to Margraten. Primarily I'm going to, I want to try and find the doctor or the family of the doctor that operated on my leg when I got wounded, because the Army had scheduled me for an amputation, and this Dutch doctor was arguing with him that he could take the shrapnel out, and the Army doctors were saying there was too much damage. And as I went under the sodium pentothal, which is what they use for anesthesia then, the Dutch doctor was saying, "I'm tired of assisting in bad decisions in my hospital." And apparently he prevailed, fortunately. And so I want to go to the Maastricht Hospital and see if they have records of who that is. The Army records have everything about my life in the Army except the name of the doctor that saved my leg. So that's the main reason for my visit. Okay.
Questions? Shall we start?
Do you want to?
Yeah. We should probably have a backup recording now, just in case. Like,
Yeah, they'll be using excerpts of this for their
Sorry?
essays, so I think they want to use. Someone else want to use a recorder?
my phone's almost dead, otherwise I'm just...
You can probably put it right next to you guys.
Yeah, just put it up here.
But yeah, from different angles. So.
There we go.
Put it
You want me to see this?
No, it's all right.
Okay.
This is recording.
Press conference. Okay.
Right.
all the microphones,
Yeah.
all the newspapers. All right.
So what's the question?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Did you have any? Did your parents or grandparents serve before you?
Yes. I had a lot of grandparents that served in the War of 1812, actually the Revolutionary War too, the War of 1812 and World War I, the Cuban War. My dad was an officer in the Army. He was the band commander and teacher of music at West Point, on the faculty at West Point, where I grew up.
And I didn't catch it. How old were you when you enlisted?
17. I was wounded when I was just barely 19, so I was just a kid. Can you tell me a little bit about your experiences during basic training? Because I have a brother, he's in the infantry right now, and I was wondering, do you think it's different going through basic training and going into service from when you enlisted to now? I don't know how much different basic training is from when I went at Fort Benning, Georgia. Oh, that's where my brother was. The infantry school. And I think, this may sound odd, but I think that basic training was the only part of my experience that I enjoyed. It was tough, but we got to catcall the officers that rode in trucks when they passed us hiking. It made us feel like we were pretty tough, and that was a good feeling. I didn't have very many good feelings in the war. Combat is something you never want to get into. Even today, where it's, if you get wounded, you get picked up immediately and taken to a hospital of some sort. Our war was pretty primitive by modern standards.
Let's see. During the your time being enlisted, did you have any particularly humorous or unusual events that occurred?
Oh, there's always things to laugh about. In fact, you look for things to laugh about in combat. Well, one, when we were first going into combat and moving up onto the line just over the German border, Bergen, Germany. It was our first time. We were all pretty nervous and pretty, scared. And we were told that we were going to be exposed going over a ridge, and so not to make any noise. And we saw the sergeant running back, and Sieberman had pulled the pin on his grenade. Why, I don't know. So he was carrying a live grenade, and so the whole column had to stop, and we were wondering, we're out here on this hill, and they told him to go bury it with the pin down in a farm field, and we all sat there and waited, and he finally came back, and he didn't blow himself up, and so we all laughed about that. There are sometimes, and usually it's somebody's naivety. Like once when we were on the Rhine, we were in a holding action getting ready to cross the Rhine, and the Germans had lots of patrols trying to find out what we were doing, how many we were. The engineers had boats that in the daylight, when the Germans could see through the binoculars, they would take the boats down to the river. Then at night they take them back up. Next day they take more boats down. They wanted the Germans to believe that it was just overpowering what was coming across the Rhine. And it apparently worked because Germans concentrated almost all their military in the Dusseldorf area, opposite where we were in the Rhine. Well, one night, if we were always challenging, of course, with the password. And, Big Jim O'Brien was on guard that night, and he heard someone approaching. Of course, it's dark, and I mean, combat dark is really dark. There's no lights of any kind, and if there's a cloud cover, it's so dark you can't even see in front of you. So he challenged, and the person who was walking stopped, but didn't answer, didn't turn around, didn't do anything. He challenged again, and this time, whoever it was ran into a building. And so Big Jim woke everybody up to report that there was a patrol in the building. And the Germans had hobnail boots, and you could hear them walking on stone, So that's what he reported. Well, we surrounded the building and started it on fire. And of course, when the Germans saw the fire, they started some artillery, but we hunkered down and waited for this patrol to run out of the building. And out comes prancing a horse. So Jim didn't live that down.
He thought the horse hooves were boots? Or?
Yeah. So it sounded like someone walking. So there were humorous things that went on, but not a lot.
Did you make any lifelong friendships during the war?
You got to be kidding.
How?
You've heard of the bonding that combat veterans have. You got to realize that you're not really an individual anymore when you go in the military. You become part of a whole. You become indistinguishable from anybody else. And there's a purpose in that. You feel you're part of a whole, and you're keeping these guys alive, and they're keeping you alive. And so you become a whole thing. And I don't think there's any deeper bonding, not for children, not for wives, not a deeper bonding than there are between combat veterans. It's I don't know how to explain it. It's just there. You are there because they protected you, and you helped to protect them.
One more. At any point during the war, did your view on war change?
Oh, very much.
And how so?
They say there's no atheists in foxholes, and that's not true. At first, I was gung-ho. I was 17, and basic really pumped me up. We were told how superior we were and how stupid the Japanese were, and how stupid it was Japs, and how stupid the Krauts were, and all of the atrocities that they were doing. It made us feel very superior. If they hadn't, we couldn't have really gone into combat. We had to feel that we were invincible, and so that's part of playing with our minds. When we went into combat, we really felt absolutely. I have. We had a song in the company. It's got the F word, so I'm not sure I should.
I think they've heard it before.
Okay. Oh, we're Captain Kinsey's Raiders. We're the rapers of the night. We're dirty sons of bitches, and we'd rather fuck than fight. Oh, flim flam, god damn, who the hell are we? We're rough and ready, fighting men of good old company B. We sang that. That was, to me, that illustrates the mindset that we went into combat with. But it didn't last long. Like at Wells, where I was wounded, we lost 47% of the company. And, we ran into a Panzer division that wasn't supposed to be there, and we lost a lot of men. And one of my very best buddies had his head blown off in front of me. My section sergeant head was cut in two across the waist with probably something similar to our .50 caliber machine gun. And a lot of my buddies went down. I couldn't believe that a personified God could do that. The buddy who was killed in front of me was liked more than anybody else. He was just one of those guys that everybody liked. He never irritated anybody. I don't know how he did it, but he was really an angel. His son was born while we were on the way overseas in the ship, so he never saw his son. I can't believe that was the result of anything but evil. To have the nicest guy in the world not even get to see his son. Does that answer the question?
Wait. Oh, yeah. Oh, so what did you miss most when you were overseas?
It's a good question. Probably my mom and her cooking. Nobody can cook pies like her. My wife claims that her mother cooks the best pies ever. I think I missed the life that I grew up. I was very privileged growing up at West Point. I got to use all the cadets' equipment, all their facilities, the pool, the canoes going out on the Hudson River. And I was pretty privileged. I realize that now. The Davis kids are pretty privileged, and so enjoy it. You know, it might not be that way later. But I think I missed that too. I missed being part of the crowd. You know, we all did everything together. We did a lot of ice skating. I played hockey. It was a date to go to a basketball game. We'd all go and sit there and try and sit close, you know. So I missed that camaraderie of the kids that I grew up with.
Okay. What were Army hospitals like?
I never knew an Army hospital in the States. When I was wounded, I went back through Maastricht, as I mentioned, where they operated on my leg, and then I was in that hospital with warm. This was November 30th, one of the coldest winters Germany had. We all had frostbite. Some guys lost their toes or their feet. After Maastricht, I was sent to let me pull on your heartstrings a little. when I was wounded, it was a teller mine, an anti-tank mine that was booby-trapped, and the guy opened the door, and luckily I only got what went between the legs of another guy that was killed. And we were both blown into an armoire, and he was bleeding all over, which ended up on me, because he was on me. And so the guys thought that I was too badly wounded to move, and so they left me there in that kitchen. My appearance when I got to the aid station, it was called, which was a kind of a temporary makeshift hospital for basically for sorting out the wounded who could be worked on and sent back, and who had to go back to a hospital in the rear. They had some doctors, mostly they had nurses and medics. And I was left out in the driveway. Well, it was a dirt road. And, you know, I was 19. I couldn't understand that I was hurt in the first place. When you get wounded, you just don't believe it. You're in denial. It hurts, but I can't be hurt. You know, I'm the U.S. infantry. Nobody can hurt me. But anyway, I was lying out there, and guys kept going in and out and in and out, and I wondered, you know, why aren't you taking care of me? I didn't know that they had already determined that I had to go way back to England. And so they had, you know, there were a lot of guys coming in, a lot of wounded, so it was not priority to get me in somewhere where I didn't belong anyway. So eventually they came out and tagged my foot and put me in another Jeep, and then that went to Maastricht, and they operated on my leg there. That was glorious, with the clean sheets and food and pretty nurses. It was quite a bit different than being in combat. And then I went to Liège, Belgium. That was a tent hospital. It wasn't really a hospital, but the Army had made it a hospital. And they had operating rooms and everything that a hospital has, but it was a tent hospital. The Army has different designations for each of these stages going back. I don't know what they are. While we were there, a buzz bomb, the Germans were using, were sending V2s? I can't remember now. V1 or V2. It was an airplane with a motor, a rocket motor on the back, and they were using it to bomb London and British towns. And some of them, they weren't all that perfect. Some of them would stop short, and one hit our hospital, a couple of tents down, and killed, of course, some nurses as well as some of the wounded. But then I went to Paris, the hospital in Paris, and that was a real hospital, like any here. Of course, I was immobile, so I couldn't go walking around and look at what it was, and what it had. I'm sure it had all the same things our hospitals had. And that was a nice stay for just a day, overnight. And then they put me in a plane to England. I ended up in Southampton, southern England. Since I had frostbite, I think that was a frostbite hospital. 3/5 of the wards were frostbite victims. And anyway, the two others were both frostbite and some other kind of one. I think I was sent there because of the frostbite. And that was a British hospital. It wasn't makeshift, it was a real hospital. The central part was the x-rays and surgery and everything. And then they had these wings that went out. There were 5 of them, and three of them were frostbite. So anyway, I wanted to tell you that to explain. I didn't see much of the hospital other than the ward that I was in.
So
Understand, talking about hospitals and medics, understand that in combat, you didn't always follow the Geneva rules. When I was wounded, that attack on Welts, the Germans killed all our medics and shelled the ambulances. And so I was wounded at 11 in the morning. I didn't get out until after dark when they could put us on jeeps and get us out. So the whole hospital thing was different than now. Now you're pretty well taken care of. We were pretty well taken care of, but in a primitive sort of way.
So you said you formed some really strong bonds with, I guess, people who were experiencing combat with you. Was the same kind of dynamic there for your instructors too?
The same dynamics for the what?
Yeah. Let's see. Was there kind of a rivalry? Like, what were your instructors like?
Instructors?
Yeah.
Do you
I
mean
mean,
like
in the-
hiring?
Like
Superior
superiors.
officers.
In the
Superior
States?
It's like senior superiors, yeah.
Well, in the States, of course, we weren't in combat. We didn't have that sharing. We did have a camaraderie because back then the barracks were very primitive. You had just a great big huge latrine. Everybody used a row of sinks. Everybody got in the shower together. All the toilets were in a row. So you started getting that feeling of belonging to a whole thing. But I'm not sure what. We didn't have rivalry other than, boy, I got through that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
'Cause I know you mentioned.
most of it was to acclimate us. You couldn't teach much about firing mortar. I was a mortar gunner. You couldn't teach much about, you fired and dropped the round and that was it. You had to learn how to aim it, but there wasn't much to teach us other than playing with our mind. And most of it was for that. For instance, we had to crawl with our weapon under a barbed wire cover while they fired live rounds over us. And if you got up, you'd be killed. That was just to give us a feeling of what it was like, the sounds and everything of rounds going over us. So that, that wasn't teaching us a skill.
How did you stay in contact with people back home?
Well, the only thing was what they called a V-mail, which was a one-page letter that folded and sealed. I don't know how the Army succeeded in finding us. It was just miraculous. When I went back to England, the first day I was there, my mail showed up. Now, how did they know that, I have no idea. It was very slow. It wasn't air mail. It went by sea, by ship. When I was wounded, they had scheduled me for an amputation, I told you. Well, there were 3 telegrams that were sent to the people at home. One was killed in action, one was badly wounded in action, and the other was just wounded in action. And my dad, being military, knew that when they got the badly wounded, that I was going to be missing a part. And our meal back and forth, I was talking about my leg hurting and you know, that I was in a good hospital and all that. But I didn't know that they thought my leg had been amputated. And they didn't say anything because they didn't want to say anything. So it was a couple of months when I was close to leaving the hospital when I told them, sent an email that I was going back to the B company. I got a very surprised letter from them saying, I thought you had been wounded badly. So my poor family went for all that time thinking that I had lost my leg. But the mail, to answer the question, the mail was just incredible. Other than it taking pretty long, and of course cell phones hadn't been invented, and like I said, I have no idea how they worked it so well. Everybody got their mail. Packages from home might take a month for a package to arrive, but it was amazing. And that was the only bright part of combat, was getting mail. Of course, we didn't get it when we were actually in an attack. It was sparse when I got back to the company. All the rest of the attack across northern Germany, we weren't stopped much. I mean, we weren't dug in much. We were in attack mode most of the time, and so of course we didn't get mail when we weren't stopped somewhere.
Were there any specific battles or events that have had a large impact on your life or that are memorable?
I'm sorry, specific battles, what?
Were there any battles or events that have had a large impact on your life or that are memorable?
I still didn't hear. I'm hard of hearing. I was a mortar gunner. A mortar you drop around in a tube, and there's a huge shotgun shell that explodes, and the mortar goes flying out. And all you can do is put your helmet down to stop the blast. So I have hearing aids. And so what is the question?
Were there any specific battles or like events that happened that
Impacted your life or were
impacted your life?
That what?
were memorable?
I'm sorry?
Impacted your life or were memorable?
What about my life?
So
Were there specific battles or events that were memorable or still have an impact on you today?
Well, they're all pretty memorable. Of course, when I got wounded, that's the most memorable. I think you know, we didn't talk to each other about battles, other than maybe a comment that might make something better next time. We joked around a lot when we were not fighting. We didn't talk much about fighting, so I think everybody was the same. You're just numb. You don't allow yourself to think. First thing you would do if you were thinking would be to turn around and go back somewhere. As nobody in his right mind would face pillboxes with machine guns and cannon. Do you students know what the Siegfried Line is? Heard of the Siegfried Line?
Yeah,
yeah.
a little bit.
It was fortifications all the way from the Baltic Sea down to Switzerland along the German border. Around Aachen and Saar, they were 13-foot thick concrete emplacements. Most of the rest were 5-foot thick emplacements. Air Force bombing had no effect. Artillery had no effect. The tank traps were very effective, such that the tanks couldn't give us support either. So it was just throwing men against pillboxes. And can you imagine making a decision to do that? So we were numb most of the time. We didn't want to think. And then when there were times that we were stopped, we were busy digging foxholes, and for the mortar crew, it was digging a big hole for the mortar and trying to find something to cover the top with. We'd build it behind a stone wall or behind a building if it was a small enough building to get around over it, but mostly behind walls, because the artillery went pretty straight. And so they couldn't reach us by going up and over like our mortars could. And the Germans hated our mortars. There was a fluke of aerodynamics. It wasn't planned, but the 60 millimeter mortars that I fired had no sound coming in. Just boom. And the Germans just hated them. There was no way of hearing them coming in, you know. The 81 millimeter mortars, they did have sound, but for some reason, just by a fluke of aerodynamics, our mortar rounds didn't have any sound. But anyway, I don't know what the question was. I was rambling.
Did you meet any refugees from nearby countries or from Germany?
As I had said, I was in occupation. After the war, the combat troops, infantry, were the last to go home. They needed us to, conquer, be in charge of the country that we were in, all over the world. And the Germans, you have to realize, took millions of refugees or millions of people from the countries they conquered and used them for slave labor. They were all free, which meant millions of people were wandering all over Germany. Most of them were trying to find their other family members. And one of our biggest jobs was to put them in concentration camps. That's kind of a joke, but the concentration camps that we took, we used to house the refugees. And we wouldn't let them out because they wanted to go find their families. And we'd put them on trains and send them back home. That was a heartbreaking job, especially when they all cried when they got on. They were going to go home, but they didn't want to. They wanted to find their lost family members. And of course, a lot of them were killed, so they wouldn't have found anything. They'd just be wandering all around Germany. So that was one of our occupation jobs.
So did you enlist or were you drafted?
No, well, both. I enlisted, and because of my eyes, I was 4-H. My dad, being an Army officer, no one is going to give my son 4-H. So he had an officer friend at the induction station in Washington, D.C., and my cousin was a doctor at the induction station, eye doctor, and so they conspired to get me to go through the line when that doctor was there, and he passed me, and so that was a volunteer for the draft. I had to wait 30 days to be a citizen of Washington, D.C. to get drafted through Fort Myers, Virginia.
So Did you bring back any souvenirs?
I'm sorry?
Did you bring back any souvenirs?
Well, I brought back some. I brought back a Luger pistol. I sold it. I don't want anything to do with firearms. The pistol was 45 was my sidearm. It's what those who were in machine gun sections and mortar sections had what were called sidearms, either submachine gun or a pistol. And in addition to carrying what they were carrying on the mortar or machine gun.
Is there any specific reason why you don't like firearms? I mean, like, I would like, is there like a little bit more in depth about that?
You kill people with firearms.
Yeah. So you
I don't want
shoot
anything
it?
to do with firearms.
Alright, and I have another quick question now. What was life like once you returned home?
Sorry?
What was your life like once you returned home?
Well, you got to realize that 13 million veterans were being discharged, and we came home a year after the war ended as occupation troops, and you know, the schools were all filled, the jobs were all taken. Everybody had heard all the stories. We were kind of like given a cold shoulder. It was just some more of the same. Been there, done that, so we didn't feel all that welcome. And then, of course, even a year later, the clothing industry hadn't caught up with the veterans coming home. I had to wear my uniform for 3 months before I could get a suit to wear civilian clothes. So that was our homecoming.
How has the war affected your life back in society?
I'm sorry?
How has the war affected your life back in society?
Well, it's hard to answer that question because I had PTSD pretty bad, I guess. I've had therapy since 1990, and combat veterans normally will not talk about combat. I've had enough therapy that I can, and because I can, I want people to hear what it really was like, not what the movies show. Incidentally, the Big Red One, movie with, what's his name? Anyway, it's about the 1st Infantry Division, and Lee Marvin is the old sergeant in that movie, and I think it's one of the best to show the endlessness, because those guys were in combat for 4 years, and the movie goes through all of their combat, and it just goes on and on and on. You have to realize that we were in for the duration, and those poor guys were just, you know, they weren't going to get out very easy. When VE Day, Victory in Europe, happened, we were really, you know, and it's great, the war's over, we're going home. And then they started outfitting us to go to Japan for the Japanese mainland attack. And fortunately, and I say that as loud as I can, fortunately Hiroshima happened, and it saved countless millions of lives. Most of us would not have made it. It took us, you know, a long time to figure out how to fight the Germans, and the Japanese were worse, so we didn't figure we were going to get out of it. So when VE Day happened, VJ Day happened, wow, we finally get to go home. Now we went into occupation. But
Would you have enlisted would you have enlisted if you would have known what the war
I would never go near the recruiters. I would have shot them.
What motivated you to enlist?
To join?
Yeah.
Everybody was. That was what everybody did. They went in the military. And if you couldn't, if you got deferred or rejected, then you went into war production or something to do with the war. I remember one email I got from my sister complaining about the gas stamps, that they couldn't go places as much as they used to, because you had to have, you had only so many stamps. If you had a war-based job, then you got more gas stamps. But I remember thinking, let's trade. I'd be happy to trade. Another?
Is there anything that you did during your time when you were deployed that you would change
What
now?
during the time?
Is there anything that you do during the time that you were deployed that you'd change now?
Did I change?
That you
would have changed, that you'd have done differently.
Oh, what would I have changed in the war?
I think he's asking, are there any specific things you did in the war that you would do differently?
Oh. Well, when we got overseas, I was still gung-ho from the training, and we landed at Cherbourg, and then we're in a holding action, bivouac in Normandy. D-Day had already happened, and I had been in the regimental band, and they were going to take the band and I suppose to save them, I don't know, make them grave registration guys. And so we had the option of leaving our company and going to, as a band, being used as grave registration. I mulled over that a long time. I had a hard time making up my mind, but the bonding with the company guys was too strong. I couldn't leave the company, so I didn't go with the band. I stayed in B Company. And I think I would have gladly taken the choice. In fact, I'll admit, when I was in the hospital in England, after I was about to be released, I talked to the doctor about my 4FIs, that if that would have rejected me, why can't it send me home? And the doctor said, no, that's not a measure that we make. So I had to go back into combat. I had made the decision that I would never go back, even then, I'm sure, if I had a choice.
So you said you were in the band. What instrument did you play?
Clarinet. Licorice stick. Are any of you in the band? You are? What are you playing?
Saxophone.
Sax, huh? Close.
Yes.
Earlier you talked about feeling numb. You used the word numb. When you got back, did that ever stop, or when did that feeling kind of go away from you?
When did the feeling of what
Like
go away?
being numb to like what was happening. You used that word earlier.
You mean combat?
Yeah.
It never goes away. It's like an addiction. You know, you can be in recovery, but it's always there. I still roll out of bed occasionally. I don't have the privilege of sleeping with my wife because I still kick around and I'm sometimes fighting, hitting the pillow, and it never goes away.
what was, you said you joined, when you joined the war, you were very, you and your troop were very like gung-ho and felt invincible. How did that, when did that feeling change? What changed it?
First attack in combat. Like Captain Kinsey, you know, the song I sang was for Captain Kinsey, our company commander. He was killed at Wells, where I was wounded. And that really got to a lot of us. He was a god. He was invincible. He was our leader. And actually, it takes, you know, you go through a series of adjustments in combat. First, you're just scared to death. And you are watching what everybody else is doing to know what you should be doing. You don't have any sense of what am I supposed to do? You're just numb. And after a few combat experiences, you start being very cautious. You protect yourself more when you can. The longer you're in combat, the less effective you are as a combat soldier. Because instead of protecting other guys, you get more and more concerned about protecting yourself. And you just automatically I think the thing that becomes different is that your mind actually starts working where it didn't before. You were so scared, you just did what you were trained to do. But then when you got used to it enough that your mind started functioning again, it kept telling you to get the hell out of this.
I have a question about the fear that you felt when you first went into combat. Did you ever have any fear of becoming a prisoner of war, or did you feel that you could prevail?
No, didn't even think of being captured. I think that when we first went into combat, our mindset was that we would fight to the death. You know, we would never surrender. And I don't think we ever thought about surrender.
And a follow-up to that, I'm specifically thinking of a character in the book they read that was particularly like self-righteous and was still gung-ho throughout the whole war and wanted to be particularly valiant. Did you know anyone like that, or did people like keep their heads down and kind of want to get it over with?
No, I didn't know anybody like that. We had one guy who had been in the Spanish War, was an American. He liked to kill things. He liked to kill people, he liked to kill animals. But it wasn't valor. But he didn't change.
Probably a good place for him.
Yeah.
I guess.
Someone, no, don't go there.
So you were talking earlier about forces dropping bombs in England, in the United Kingdom. Do you remember when the Royal Army dropped 25? When the Royal Army dropped 2,300 tons of bombs on Berlin?
No, but I saw one of the. I'm going to answer your question in a different way.
Sure.
That's a good question. And I have a very informative answer. But I saw one bombing raid going overhead. You know, we heard this kind of rumble, and then it got louder, and we realized it was coming from above. And there we're up at whatever, 30,000 feet, horizon to horizon in all directions, bombers heading for Germany. And one of the guys was looking through some binoculars, and the German town that we were trading patrols every night, they were out looking at the bombers also. And we thought, look at them, they're coming. That was early in my combat experience where I was still, well, we're going to get them. Now, to answer your question, there were 87 million people killed in World War II. 65 million of those, 3/4, were non-combatants. This is all in Wikipedia if you want to look it up.
Don't use Wikipedia as a source. You can't.
Well, it's a good source most of the time. There
No,
are times.
we just don't use it in essays, but we can definitely talk about Wikipedia.
Well,
Continue, sorry.
65 million non-combatants, women, children, elderly. The Japanese killed 20 million Chinese, and the Germans killed 27 million Russians. That's an awful lot of people. There's no statistic on how many people we killed in our bombing raids. You can't find a statistic. Since World War II, another statistic that was in a paper, not Wikipedia, and I can email you the source if you want. We have killed 25 million civilians since World War II in the various wars in 29 countries all over the world. We kill more people faster than any other country can. And that's just part of my prejudice about weapons. There's no way to stop it without eliminating weapons.
I have a question. Do you think that war can be beneficial or right?
Well, it's beneficial to everybody who's making munitions. You know, I've been panel for a number of presentations where they talked about the cost of war. The students talk about the cost of war, and they talk about all these billions of dollars. That isn't the cost of war. That's the benefit of war, because all that money is going into somebody's industry's pocket.
Do you think war can be beneficial, like, as a whole, like, as a world community? Like, do you think...
Well, there's always good results. The fact that we had the Marshall Plan and bailed Germany and Japan out helped the world economy and, of course, us. We benefited by gaining territory, Guam, and I don't know how many. We have a whole bunch of islands in the South Pacific that we own. And a lot of countries benefited. Israel was created after World War I by the British in Palestinian land. There's some people benefit.
Do you think that those benefits are justified?
No, never. I even could say that I don't know if fighting Germany was the right thing to do. If Germany had conquered us, and they were very close to getting the atom bomb and an ICBM that could hit New York City. That was Hitler's, one of his passions, was to try and have ground zero on Manhattan. And we probably would have capitulated. And do you know how big the United States is and how small Germany is? And they already have lost, at that point, at the end of the war, they've lost millions and millions of people. They would have had, and their country was devastated. Any country, any city that had anything to do with war production was bombed, that we knew about. And it was literally destroyed. If Germany had become the administrator of this country, we would have hated it. They probably would have murdered all the Jews. But eventually our independent nature, we would have prevailed, I'm sure, in kicking them out. So what have we accomplished by killing 87 million people? I don't know. I'm going to pass on that one.
I have a related question. Has the attitude that you just described about war and violence made you fatalistic or defeatist or pessimistic about modern society in general, or just war? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Or like humans, people.
That's a good question, which is difficult for me to answer.
It's a big one, sorry.
No, it's just that I'm very ambivalent. I would sure like to shoot Trump. Now that, you don't go around wanting to shoot people, you know? So part of being a combat veteran is still in me. I still see violence as a way to take somebody out that you don't want, but I don't think that's right. And I feel very sorry for our country and the children. What are we giving them, you know? My generation screwed up. We're giving you a country that is wrong in lots of ways. We have a military that cannot be, you know, the Second Amendment gives us a right to bear arms. That was established when the militias had the same weapons that the army had. And it was to prevent anarchy or prevent tyranny. The people could arm themselves and form militias and fight the army and eliminate the tyrants. Well, there's no way you're going to fight the current army. No way that people are going to fight them in the streets. They might try, but they're not going to win.
That's true.
So I feel sorry. I'm glad I'm going to be dying in 10, 20 years, whatever. Because you guys have a real tough job. I feel very ashamed of what we're giving you.
So,
And all those guys, my buddies that died, I'm sure they could feel the same way.
so what you were talking about, the Da Vinci kids talking about the cost of war. What do you think the cost of war is?
The people that are killed. And the bombing and all, that's after the people are dead, then it's not so much cost of war as a benefit. You get all new buildings, everything's new, and that is a cost, but it's not the cost of war that, as I see it. The guys that are buried in the cemeteries in Europe and Japan and the South Pacific, all over Europe. There's several of them at Normandy. I'm going to go to Gardley to oh goodness, how could I forget? Margaret Cemetery in Holland. Oh, incidentally, I've talked to some people in the Netherlands, and I've talked about the Holland people, and they correct me very angrily that it is not, Holland is just 2 provinces of the Netherlands, and it's Netherlands, not Holland. Anyway, I'm going to go to the Netherlands, to Margraten, and that's where my company B is.
So, back to your experience in the war, what would an average day of combat be like for you?
It's no average. Are you asking what is it like?
Yeah.
Well, as I've said, I don't have a hell of a lot of detailed memory of the attacks that we were on. And I want to go to that beet field that we walked across and were cut down in. But I don't really remember much. I remember Blackie Milano. He was a very dark Italian, and his nickname was Blackie. He was the gunner, my gunner. I was assistant gunner, and we were taught in the mortar squad that you had to keep everybody together, because if you end up without a tripod, you can't fire it. If you end up without a barrel, you can't fire it. So you always stayed together. Well, when we got pinned down out in this beet field by the Panzer tank 88s, everybody was lying on the ground. Some guys were trying to dig slit trenches, and Blackie just couldn't take it anymore, so he screamed and got up and started running for the woods that we were supposed to go to. And so the rest of the squad got up to follow him. I mean, you got to stay together. And then the whole platoon got up, and then the whole company. I think that started the assault proper, where we had, the whole regiment had been pinned down. And so I don't remember much. I do remember Blackie screaming and getting up, and I remember getting up to follow him. Most of the time you were pretty numb. I don't really know how to answer that, other than you don't remember noise, for one thing. Everything seems quiet. All the memories, anyway, seem quiet. I remember one time when, in that attack, we couldn't get the reason we had such heavy casualties is that we couldn't get our heavy machine guns and mortars and artillery to cease fire. We were going and upgrade. We had to go up into the fire. We were supposed to tell them to stop, but all of our radios had been, either the guys were killed or the radios hit. And so we had no way to communicate. And so all we could do is go up into the fire. I remember one time I was lying behind a haystack, and it was in a field, and our own 81 millimeter mortars were traversing across us. And I remember trying to take a picture, because as a mortarman, I was really impressed. They were perfect in their movement, and one landed right in front of me and blew me back into another haystack. I was not hurt, miraculously. But I do remember trying to take that picture. You don't remember much. Your mind has to turn off. Later combat, I have a lot more memory than the earlier combat.
I have a question about something else that tied into the book. Do you recall the firebombing in Dresden?
No, I wasn't there, but I of course read about it. That was one of the worst things that we did. There was no reason to kill all those people.
Afterwards, did you feel that you were recognized enough for your service? And did that change during the Vietnam War? When there was anti-war protests everywhere?
Well, when we got home, I can't tell you just how much getting home meant. That's all we thought about. And so getting home was the greatest thing that ever happened. And that shaded everything. No matter what anybody did, it was great. You know, I was home. And what was the question?
Did it change that kind of respect? Did it change during the Vietnam War?
Oh, yeah. The Vietnam War was sad.
Yeah.
What they did to their veterans. Spit on them. It became common for them to be walking down the street and someone walk up and spit on them.
Wow.
I've talked to a lot of them, you know. A lot of people say, oh, well, some few must have done that. And I hated the war, but I love the veterans. Well, talk to the Vietnam veterans, and they'll tell you what they really were treated like. I haven't met any Vietnam veteran that didn't feel really betrayed by his country.
Did you ever feel that you were betrayed by your country?
Oh, yeah. Combat is a betrayal.
Just a quick note, we have about 8 minutes left, so if people maybe haven't spoken up in a while and you have a question.
I'd like to show you this that I brought and pass it around, if we have just a minute.
Yeah.
This was the attack through Germany that my division did, the 102nd Infantry. This is a blow-up of this little area. Each of these blue lines is an attack that we made and stopped, and then were counterattacked. This is Welch, where I was wounded. This is our attack. Then, after the war, we were sent down to Bavaria in occupation. The Germans' standard defense was to attack. When we started to attack, they would counterattack. That was their standard operation. And so it was always just a short mile or two that we went each time. And then we would have to stop and dig in and try and repulse the German attack. So I just wanted to pass that around so that you have a chance to see it.
While it's being passed around, so I know that you received several commemorative awards for your service. Can you talk about them a little bit?
Well, I got a Purple Heart, of course, for being wounded. There's, among combat veterans, the Purple Heart means more than any other. We had a guy in the company in the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, who died a few years ago. Ernie Head. He had been wounded slightly, and he put a band-aid around his leg where he'd been wounded, and then he kept fighting, and he never got a Purple Heart. And to him, I told him, well, you know, we'll testify, and I'm sure that you can get the record of what happened. and we can get you a Purple Heart. And he said, oh no, they'd laugh me out of the company for a little wound like that. That's not a Purple Heart. And that was the attitude that most of the combat veterans had, that getting a Purple Heart meant that you were taken out of action. And that it was the most noble thing that you could do. I got a Bronze Star for something that I don't think it was any heroism. When we were stopped there at Wells in the woods, after we got into the woods and were under our own fire, Captain Kinsey signaled to the mortars to fire signal flares. And we were in the middle of the day, you know. We must not understand. And so I ran across the field over to his position, and he said, yes, just do it. So I ran back and we did it, but it didn't stop the firing that was coming in. And I didn't know that a machine gun was following me, trying to hit me, both going and coming. But, you know, what was heroic about not knowing? So anyway, they gave me a Bronze Star for that. The presidential commendation was for Wells. We lost so much, but we took our objective. We even had the Air Force bomb the machine gun positions established on the other side of Wells. The Air Force, they had panels, great big huge plastic panels, like 12 foot by 20 foot. They were bright colors, neon colors, and that marked the front lines. Anything on the German side of the panels was fair game. Well, somehow they didn't get pulled in when we jumped off the Wells. And so the Air Force did what they were supposed to. They strafed and bombed us. And the guys that set up the machine gun positions had to retreat back into Wells. But we still took Wells.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us before we finish? Anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I wanted to get in the 87 million conversation, even though that is Wikipedia. And any other source you find, there are some others, and the 87 is sort of an average in my mind of what the other sources showed. I'm sure it was close to that. And you know how many that is? You know how many that would stretch around the world? It's a terrible war. One of my very good friends was a P-38 fighter pilot, and his job was to hit ground troops, trucks, tanks, anything. And he had a hard time knowing how many times he was aiming and firing and killing people. And I think that's the hardest thing that war does to those who... See, I was fortunate as a mortar gunner. We were always behind something. Couldn't see what we were killing. And our spotter would tell us where our rounds went and what it was doing. So it was kind of secondhand hearsay. But all of the people, including the Air Force, that dropped so many bombs on civilian positions, and the artillery guys, like the mortarmen, were always behind something, and so they didn't have to experience as much killing. But those who had to, that's a hard price to pay, because it never goes away.
Why? How does killing civilians benefit the standing of your side of the war?
How did it?
But I understand that in war, like a lot of times civilians are killed. How does that help towards the end goal of winning?
Siblings?
How does killing civilians
Oh,
help win the
civilians.
war?
Well, you did what you were told to do. The Air Force guys were told to bomb this area, and they did. The ground support guys were told to shoot anything on the German side of the banners. And we were told to kill any German we saw. It wasn't a decision. That's the only cop-out that combat veteran has. Wasn't my decision.
I have a question. I think you said it in the beginning, but what did you do for school or work after the war?
Well, I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic in Troy, New York, and then the University of Michigan. Rensselaer was aeronautical engineering, but I was looking for truth, and so I quit and went to University of Michigan social psychology, and I ran out of the GI Bill and went to work for the Bell Telephone Lab in New York City, down in Greenwich Village, and I was with engineers, and I felt I was home, so I went back to Wayne State University to get an industrial engineering degree, and worked for the auto industry, the aerospace industry here at Airjet, and then got a job as the branch chief of the industrial engineering branch at Mather Civil Engineering Division, and worked there for 15 years, and then 10 years at Travis, same job, with a big promotion. And during that time, I also learned to fly civilian airplanes, and flew with the Civil Air Patrol as search pilot for the Air Force for 16 years here in California, and I'm very proud of that. I was only a buck sergeant in the infantry, but I was a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And then after I retired, I started the Ballroom of Sacramento, dance studio and ballroom, and taught swing, Latin, and ballroom dancing for just 2 years. But I loved it. Being a teacher is one of the most incredible experiences of my life.
That's a good note to end on. Anyone have anything else before we leave?
Thank you so much for your time and for your service.
I'm sorry?
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right.
I do get a lot of people saying thank you. I wear the hat because I want people to ask questions. But I do get a lot of thanks, which I appreciate.
We appreciate you.
And I send it all to the guys that didn't make it.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Here you go.